Steve Harvey opened his father's Bible after 30 years. A sealed letter fell out. It was old, untouched, and addressed to Ibrahim Traoré. Steve Harvey had never touched his father's Bible since the day they buried him. It sat quietly on the highest shelf in the back room, wrapped in cloth, untouched for 30 years. It wasn't just a book. It was sacred and painful. But something strange pulled at him that morning. He had just finished recording a podcast, was sipping his coffee. The sun had barely risen, but something inside him whispered, "Go open the Bible." He couldn't explain it. It wasn't logic. It was. So he walked to the shelf. His hand hesitated for a second. Then he reached up, unwrapped the faded cloth, and pulled the Bible down. The leather was cracked. The cover nearly rubbed off. Holy Bible, Jesse Harvey, 1963. Steve opened the front page, and something slipped out. It hit the floor. With a soft thud, Steve looked down. It was a thick, sealed envelope yellowed with age. The paper felt stiff, untouched for decades, and on the front was handwriting he hadn't seen in years. To Ibrahim Traoré, do not open. Steve froze. He read it again. Ibrahim Traoré? The name sounded familiar. He'd heard it on the news. African president. A young, controversial leader. But what did his father, an old Christian man from Cleveland, Ohio, have to do with him? Steve sat down, heart racing. He turned the envelope over. Still sealed. No date, no return address. Just his father's clear handwriting. And something told him this was not a mistake. He didn't open it. Not yet. He just stared at it for the next hour. Then he whispered, "God, what are you trying to tell me?" That night, Steve couldn't sleep. He searched everything he could find about Traoré, youngest African president. Military background. Loved by the people, feared by the West. Grew up poor. His parents died early. Became a soldier at 19. Rumors said he survived something at age 12. A crisis nobody talks about. Steve's hands tightened around the envelope. Is that the connection? The next morning, he was sitting alone at his kitchen table when his phone rang. Unknown number. Foreign country code. He hesitated. Picked up. Hello? A calm, accented voice responded. Mr. Harvey, we are calling from Ouagadougou. The president would like to invite you for a private visit. Steve's body stiffened. He didn't breathe. Who? He asked. The president, Ibrahim Traoré. Silence. The man continued. He requested you specifically. Steve glanced down at the envelope still lying on the table. This wasn't random. He whispered, "I'll be there." Steve landed in Ouagadougou 2 days later. No cameras, no press, no big event. Just a quiet car waiting at the airport, and a driver who said only one thing. The president is expecting you. The drive was silent. Steve stared out the window as they moved through the dusty roads. Everything felt unfamiliar. The buildings, the colors, the air. But deep inside, something felt right. The letter was still in his coat pocket. He hadn't opened it. Something told him it wasn't meant for him to read. Not yet. They reached a private compound on the edge of the city. No soldiers. Just silence. The kind of silence you only hear when something important is about to happen. A tall man in plain clothes opened the door for him. "This way, Mr. Harvey." Steve followed him down a hallway. Simple, quiet, lined with old photos and wooden doors. The man opened the last door on the left. Inside was a room with one chair, and one man standing by the window. Ibrahim Traoré. He turned slowly. Steve had seen many powerful men, but something about this one felt different. He didn't carry pride. He carried weight, like a man holding something nobody else could see. "Mr. Harvey," he said quietly. Steve nodded. "Mr. President." They sat down across from each other. Steve didn't waste time. He reached into his coat, pulled out the envelope, and placed it on the table. Traoré's eyes narrowed. He didn't touch it. He just stared. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "Where did you find this?" Steve spoke gently. "It was in my father's Bible, hidden for over 30 years. Traoré's expression shifted. His hands clasped together. He leaned back slightly, as if something he buried long ago had suddenly returned. Steve asked, "Do you know what it is?" The president nodded. "I don't need to open it," he said softly. "I know exactly what's inside." Steve leaned forward. "Then help me understand. Why would my father, a man from Cleveland, who never left the U.S., write a letter to you?" Traoré looked down at the envelope. Then he spoke, slowly, carefully. "I met your father when I was a child. I don't know how he got here. I don't know why, but I was 12. And I was alone. My village had just been attacked. My mother was gone. My father had disappeared months earlier. I was running, hiding. I hadn't eaten in days." His voice broke slightly, then steadied again. And then he appeared. Steve didn't blink. He didn't come with anyone. He wasn't dressed like a soldier or a preacher. Just a brown coat, a hat, and a Bible in his hand. He saw me, sat next to me, gave me water, said one thing: "You are not forgotten." Steve's eyes widened. Traoré nodded. He gave me a piece of paper, just 4 words written on it. That same sentence. I kept it. I still have it. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a small plastic pouch, and handed it to Steve. Inside was a faded, handwritten card. "You are not forgotten." Psalm 27:10. Steve held the card like it was a piece of his father's voice. This is real." Traoré continued. "He only stayed with me one day. Then he said, 'One day, the world will forget who you were, but a man who carries my blood will remind you.'" Steve looked up. "Carries his blood?" Traoré nodded. "You." Steve leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. "My father never spoke about this. Not once. Because it wasn't time," Traoré said. He finally reached for the envelope. Carefully, he opened it. The seal cracked. The paper inside was still clean, not aged, not dusty, like it had waited in silence for this moment. Traoré read it silently. Then he looked up and handed the letter to Steve. "Read it," he said. Steve's hands trembled slightly. He unfolded the paper and began. "To the boy I met by the red road. I told you I would remember. And I did. Every day. I don't know who you'll become, but I believe something in you is meant for more." Steve kept reading. "I'm leaving this with my son, Steve. If he finds this, it means you're still alive. And it means the world still needs your memory. If he brings this to you, then Steve, you've done your father proud. You delivered more than a message. You delivered a bridge. And to you, young man, never forget. Even when the world forgets your name, God doesn't." Steve closed the letter. No one said anything. Then Traoré spoke again. "I don't know how your father knew who I would become. I don't even know how he got to my country. But I know what I felt when he sat next to me." Steve looked at him. "What?" "Peace." The room went quiet. Then Traoré stood. "I want to show you something," he said. He walked to the back of the office, opened a small door, and led Steve down a narrow hallway. At the end was a locked drawer in the wall, old, metal. dusty. He opened it with a key only he carried. Inside was a single cassette tape, wrapped in plastic. He handed it to Steve. My staff found this at an abandoned mission station 2 years ago. It had your father's initials on it, J.H. Steve stared at the tape. There was a note inside the plastic. Play only when the world starts forgetting. Steve looked at Traoré. You think this is for you? No, he said. It's for us. Steve stared at the cassette in his hand. It was real, physical, heavy in meaning. The note wrapped around it was written in the same old handwriting he recognized as his father's. Play only when the world starts forgetting. He looked at Traoré. Where did you say this was found? Traoré answered softly. In a room under an old mission building. It had been sealed shut since the late 1980s. My team was investigating the property for restoration. The tape was found inside a locked drawer, wrapped in cloth, along with a copy of a map. A map? Traoré nodded. But the map wasn't of Africa. It was of Ohio. Steve blinked. You're joking. I'm not. It was. Hand-drawn, had a circle around a small neighborhood. It said, where the journey began. Steve leaned forward, whispering more to himself than anyone else. What was my father doing all those years ago? Traoré handed him the old cassette player. One of the staff had found it that morning. Big, boxy, and surprisingly, still worked. They sat down across from each other. The room was silent. Steve gently placed the cassette inside the slot. Closed it. Pressed play. A soft crackle. Then a voice. His father's voice. If this is being played, unlikely. Long gone. But time never really ends, son. It only folds. Steve's eyes welled instantly. That voice. That calm, slow tone. Exactly how he remembered it. I never told you everything, Steve. There were things I didn't know how to say. Things I didn't think you were ready for. But if you're hearing this, it means you are. A long pause on the tape. In 1982, I took a trip. Not for business. Not for preaching. Just a whisper I couldn't ignore. God told me to go. Even though I didn't understand why. I didn't tell anyone except your mother. I just packed my Bible and followed. The calling. Steve covered his mouth with his hand. I walked, got lost, ended up on a red road somewhere near the edge of a broken village. That's where I saw him. A boy, scared, alone, hungry. Something in me knew I was sent for him. Traoré's head lowered slightly. He remembered that moment like it happened yesterday. I didn't say much. Just gave him water, sat with him, and handed him the card I always carried. You are not forgotten. He didn't speak at first, but his eyes told me everything. Steve whispered, "This is real." I left the next day, but I knew I had planted something, and I promised myself if I ever had the chance, I'd make sure he remembered. The tape hissed softly, then continued. Steve, if you're hearing this and you found him, tell him this. You were never lost. You were never invisible. You were chosen. Not by me, by something greater. Another pause. The world will forget your sacrifices, son. They'll twist your name. But heaven remembers. And now, so does my son. Click. The tape stopped. Silence again. Steve wiped his face. He wasn't crying. He was processing. So was Traoré. He stood slowly, walked to the window, looked out over the Capitol. I never thought I'd hear his voice again, he said. Steve looked at him. You never knew his name? No, he never gave. It just smiled and said, one day, someone who looks like me will remind you. Steve stood now too. My father wasn't perfect, he said. But he believed in purpose. He didn't always explain things, but he felt things. Traoré nodded. That day changed me. I stopped running. I joined a school for young orphans. That's where I learned to read, to think, to dream. Without that moment, I don't become who I am. Steve looked around the room. The books, the letters, the cassette still sitting quietly on the table. Everything in this space told a story, but one part was still missing. What about the map? Steve asked. Traoré went to a cabinet and pulled it out, folded, aged, hand-drawn. It was unmistakably a small neighborhood in Cleveland. That's where we lived when I was a kid, Steve whispered. There was a red circle around one house. It wasn't Steve's. It was a neighbor's, an old man named Elijah. Steve frowned. I haven't thought of him in 40 years. Who was he? Traoré asked. Steve sat down slowly. He was a quiet man. Lived 2 doors down. Nobody really knew him, but every Sunday he'd walk to our church. My dad always said, that man's seen things, just not talking about them. Traoré unfolded the back of the map. There was something written in ink. Go back to where silence lives. You'll find what was never lost. Steve stood up. I need to go home. That night, Steve flew back to the U.S., landed in Cleveland the next morning. He didn't call anyone, didn't post a thing, just rented a car and drove to that old neighborhood, now quiet, older, forgotten. The house in the red circle still stood, weathered, abandoned. Steve walked up to the porch. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was dusty, furniture covered in sheets. But the air felt like it hadn't moved in years. He walked toward the fireplace. Above it was a faded painting of a red dirt road, trees, and one figure walking, alone in the distance. He stepped closer, and there, in tiny handwriting at the bottom corner, were the initials. His father had painted this? No one had ever told him. Beneath the painting was a small wooden box. Steve opened it. Inside was another letter, unopened, addressed to the one who never stopped believing. Steve stood frozen. The air in the room felt heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. That small wooden box, the sealed letter, and the painting of the red dirt road with his father's initials. Everything inside this forgotten house whispered one thing. There's still more to this story. He carefully picked up the envelope. To the one who never stopped believing. The handwriting matched his father's, elegant, steady, just slightly curved at the ends. The ink was faded but still clear. Steve took a breath, then slowly opened it. Inside, the paper was crisp like it had waited silently, patiently. He unfolded it and began to read. If you've made it here, son, then you've carried more than a message. You carried my memory, my voice, my unfinished work. Steve sat down slowly, the letter trembling in his hands. I never told you everything because I didn't want to confuse you. I needed time to shape you, to let life do its part. But now I know you were always meant to finish what I started. You remember Mr. Elijah from down the street? He was more than a neighbor. He was the reason I ever set foot in Africa. Steve's eyes widened. Back in the 70s, Elijah was a missionary, quiet, wise. He came back from a trip one day and said something strange. God told me the next person I share this map with will carry healing across generations. That person was me. Steve swallowed hard. I followed that map once, and on that trip, I met a boy who had no name, no food, and no reason to keep living. I didn't give him much, just water, a card, and a sentence. But I felt something crack in the universe that day. Now, I believe that boy grew into something far greater than I ever imagined. And I believe you, my son, were always meant to return this to him, not because of who you are, but because of who he was. If this story still matters, then don't let it end with a letter. Let it live through action. The letter ended with a single line: "You are not forgotten." Steve folded the paper, held it to his chest, and let the silence say what words never could. He sat in that house for over an hour. No phone, no voice, just stillness, and the sound of his father's legacy breathing through the walls. 2 weeks later, back in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood alone in the palace courtyard. He wasn't expecting a call, but his phone buzzed. Private number. He picked up. A calm voice on the other end. "Mr. President, check your doorstep." He walked out. There was a small brown package. He opened it. Inside, a copy of the cassette, the second letter, and a new card. It said, "You are not forgotten. Steve Harvey, son of Jesse Harvey." Traoré didn't say anything. He just smiled. For the first time in years, he felt like that boy again, sitting on a red dirt road, a stranger handing him hope. Only this time, the boy had grown up, and the story had come full circle. If this story moves something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need the reminder. You are not forgotten. Have you ever carried someone's memory without even realizing it? Tell us in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear your story. Sometimes, the most forgotten people carry the deepest purpose, and all it takes is one voice to remind them they were never invisible.